Alright guys, welcome back to another video. So in this one we're going to be building a shaker style studio stool. So this stool comes from the book How to Make Shaker Furniture, which you can find a link to by visiting my website under the library section. So the idea behind this stool is that the shakers made it in a few different sizes to suit their needs for wherever it was going to be used. So the one that I'm specifically making would be used behind a transaction counter or for a cashier, so they're up a little bit higher. That's the whole point of it, is it's a very tall stool. Now what I've found is that this is probably the most common one you'll see around because this is where they were mostly used, but there is also a bunch of other versions, everything from 12 inches tall up to about 40 inches tall like this one. And so the idea behind this stool is that it's meant to be very comfortable to sit on with a nice shaped seat, but it's also meant to be very stable because the idea is that you're probably doing some work on it, whether that's milking a cow in the case of the shorter versions, or you're sitting at a library doing stuff. So it's meant to have a nice wide base, and it's all based structurally off of the seat. So much like a Windsor chair, what we're going to be doing is gluing up a solid panel, which you're seeing me do here for the top, and then we're going to be attaching our post legs to this nice solid panel with some drilled holes. Now the plans in the book call for a 16 by 18 oval. Now the one thing I have yet to figure out how to cut properly in the shop is ovals. I have not figured out how to make those kind of elongated shapes nicely without some super complicated jigs that I just didn't particularly want to get into on this project. So I decided to just make an 18-inch circle and work from there. And so this bandsaw jig makes quick work of cutting that 18-inch circle. It's a super stable way of cutting it, and it's very safe and very easy. Then with the seat cut round, I could start laying out my marking lines and then using my Greg Pennington laser drilling guides to drill the angled holes in these seats. Now the way that I set this up is that the back legs are going out at a 23-degree angle and the front legs are going out at a 14-degree angle. I wasn't sure whether or not these would be the right angles, and you'll hear me talk about this near the end of the video there, about what I think about that specific angles that I chose, but overall I think that it came out looking pretty good. And these drilling guides made an absolutely massive difference in the accuracy. The holes came out perfectly straight, and I was able to fit up the tenons amazingly at the end. I was very surprised at how much having these laser angled guides really helped things out. And so I'm going to include a link down in the description to the blog post that Greg Pennington put out about these laser drilling guides, because these make a massive difference. I think anywhere in the shop where you need to hand drill out a hole, they're going to make it just a lot more accurate of a process. Then we get to move on to making the legs. Now the legs are probably the most exciting part because I finally get to use my lathe for the purpose that I bought it for. Now I've talked about this in a lot of videos before. The main reason that I bought the lathe that I bought is because of its ability to turn spindles. Now in most cases this lathe is not a very good lathe. It's a very cheap lathe, but the one benefit that it does have is that you can buy a really long bed extension for it and get it up to about 42 inches overall between centers. Now this is exactly like I said, perfect for spindles, because when you're spindle turning, you're not changing your RPMs a lot. You're basically just staying at one setting the whole time, and having that long bed lets you work with long leg stock like I'm doing here. And so you can see another jig that we made in that chair making jigs video that I put out a little while back, the long tool rest for my lathe. Now the benefit again here is with this long tool rest, I can run my roughing gouge or any of my other tools along the full length of the spindle. And so one of the important things I've been learning so far about spindle turning is to just always make your spindle oversized, because it's easier to size it on the lathe than it is to size it afterwards. Because if on the lathe, it's very easy just using the parting tool to cut to your top and bottom lines and get an exactly sized piece. Now you can see here that when I'm cutting the tenons, I start out by using my bowl gouge just because that's the most efficient way that I had to do it. The reason I'm not using the roughing gouge or any of my other tools is just purely because it's a very tight space quite near the tailstock there. Now later on the back legs, what I found is that if I actually shift everything down a little bit and have my tenon fully enclosed, that made it a lot easier to work on. And so the final thing I did to these legs before taking them off the lathe is just adding a slight taper to them. So at the top of the legs, they're about 1.5 inches round, and they taper down to a 1-inch round at the very bottom. And so you can see on these legs that there's still those little nubs left on the end. So the best way to get rid of those is just with a handsaw to just slice them right off, and then you're left with perfectly sized legs. Then to level the base of the stool, because at this point the corners of the legs were actually sitting flat, all you need to do is put it on a flat surface like your table saw, draw a line around where the legs are sitting, and then you just cut them at that angle with your saw and they come out perfectly flat. Now I ended up having to do this process twice on the stool just because the first time I did it here got it mostly flat, but then when I went in and added my cross stretchers and spindles, that made it me not as squared up anymore, which is definitely something I need to work on, but it just took another process of just cutting off a little bit of material to make sure it was perfectly flat. And then the laser levels came in handy again for drilling these holes for the stretchers because I could line up the laser level at the exact height that I needed, and I had a perfectly level line to then drill across with. So by making sure that the top of the stool was completely level with the table saw, then having the laser level line of everything just made this process extremely easy to do. And so much like the leg stock, these stretchers were quite simple to turn. They're just a 3/4 inch round spindle with a 1/2 inch by 1 inch long tenon on either end. I decided to try and get a little bit fancy with it and add some tapers to it, which I didn't really like in the end because I'm not that good on the lathe just yet. But again, I think with a little bit of practice that will come out a little bit better in the future. And so I really was a fan of working with these long tool rests through this whole project because it definitely made it a lot easier just being able to work the piece and not have to constantly move the tool rest around. Then the only time I had to remove it was for sanding, just purely because I didn't want to catch my hand on that tool rest and get it stuck between the spinning workpiece and that tool rest. But again, really not that big of a deal. It was only a couple of bolts and then the tool rest comes free. With all of the spindles put together and the whole base finally constructed, we could move on to carving the seat. Now there's a very important reason why you wait to carve the seat until all of your spindles and your base is built out, is just because you want to have as much structural integrity in those legs when you're drilling into them as you could possibly get. And so before I carve the seat, I'm just drilling some of these reference holes to the depth that I want, because I know right near the front of the seat here, I want the carving to be fairly deep so that your legs have a very small edge to wrap around. And so I used an angle grinder with a cuts-all medium extreme disc on it. That's a very confusing thing to say, but it's basically just a disc with a whole bunch of little carbide teeth on it that's meant to remove a lot of material. Now the one thing that I would do differently, or that I plan to do differently in the future, is I want to get the more aggressive cuts-all carving disc, because this one being the medium grit took quite a while to remove as much material as I had to remove from the seat. Whereas they also have a coarse and an extra coarse version that would help remove material a lot faster, which I found is a much more common thing when working with hardwoods like this. Now the one downside to power carving is that you have to do a ton of hand sanding. Now there are a few different ways that I've found to work around the contours and that with sanding these seats, but I really didn't feel like buying any special tools for this project at this moment. Then the last thing to do before the glue up is to add in some slots for the wedges that we're going to add. So the whole point of these wedges is to just splay out the top of these tenons to make sure that they can't be pulled back through these holes. And so I'm just using this little jig that I made for my bandsaw to support the leg, and then I'm just cutting a single straight line down the tenon with the bandsaw. Now what's really important here is that you have to make sure that you're at the right angle, because if you put your wedge in the wrong direction, it can quite literally split your entire seat in half. So you need to make sure that you're always, when you're putting in your wedge, you're always putting pressure on the end grain of the hole, not on the side grain. And so the orientation of the wedge is also something that took me a little while to figure out, and when I did, I made a whole bunch of blanks so that in the future I would have basically whatever size I needed. And so you want to make sure that the grain is running down your wedge, because quite often, at least for when I was trying to figure out how to do it, I kept cutting it so that it was end grain on both sides, and that was a very weak wedge that I was making. Then the last and probably most important part is to make sure you cut off any excess tenon that you have on there. You can leave a little bit extra on there just to have a little bit of support, but you want to make sure you want to be as close to the seat as possible when you pound in your wedges so that you're not trying to pound them through that extra 2 inches of material that you have on there. Alright guys, so the stool is now completely finished up and it's looking great. I love this combination of cherry and maple. I do have to say that the book said that it should be made from walnut and maple, and I think that would be a better mix, but cherry is a much cheaper wood and much easier to learn how to carve on compared to walnut. Because I'm sure if I made the seat out of walnut, I would have screwed up on the carving part of it. So in the future, I probably will remake a stool like this with a few different changes here and there, mainly making it out of walnut. Now the one thing that I would change with this stool is the leg angles. So on the back side here, I did a 23-degree angle, and on the front side, I did a 14-degree angle. Now the problem here is that they're just too different from each other, so the stool overall looks a little bit weird. So if I did the front legs at that 18-degree angle that I also have on my angle gauge there, I think that would balance it out a little bit more. But I think overall, if I put all 4 legs at the exact same angle, I think that would look a little bit better than how it does right now. Because on the back side here, it splays out much wider, it sticks out further back, and then on the front, it's fairly straight off here. So it's just one of those minor things, but again, I don't think it looks bad here either, because one of the nice things about having the legs this straight on the front is that I can tuck it up nice and close to the workbench. And so even before I put finish on this thing, I was starting to use it around the shop, just anytime I had to sit at the workbench. I even did a few videos sitting on it. It's a really comfortable way to sit. Because of that curved seat, it fits your butt pretty nicely. It's much more comfortable than just sitting on a normal stool. And the way this is set up with the legs at this little bit of a steeper angle in the front means that you can get it up nice and close to the underside of my workbench or something, and I can put my feet right on this top rung here, and everything about this just fits up really nicely. So it is a really good stool. And so my plan for this stool is to just kind of keep it around the shop as a shop stool, when I'm recording videos sitting at the workbench, or when I can take it to markets with me when I just have to sit behind a table all day. This will be a little bit more of a comfortable way to be up a little bit higher so people can see me pretty easily, but while I also don't have to be just standing around all day. And so I'm really excited with how the stool came out. The carving was definitely the part that I was most stressed about. I didn't know if I was going to actually be able to shape it properly. Now I can say that I do need a little more practice with shaping, because I've definitely got some weird areas in there, but overall it's very comfortable to sit in, and that's all that matters at the end of the day. So as always guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.